In this video, we'll take a look at the 6 openings that the legendary Bobby Fischer played most frequently. We'll analyze one game in each opening, and don't go anywhere because we'll be finishing up with his all-time favorite opening. In the first game, Fischer starts e4 as he usually does, and Black replies c6, the Caro-Kann defense. Fischer continues knight c3, and after d5, he plays knight f3, the 2 knights attack, his 6th favorite opening and one he's played 24 times in his career. With the 2 knights attack, White is choosing to develop his pieces rapidly while staying flexible with his d-pawn. Black captures the pawn on e4 and White recaptures, centralizing his knight, which Black immediately challenges with knight f6. Now White does not want to retreat his knight because it would give Black the free hand to make any move that he likes. So White captures the knight, doubling Black's pawns after he recaptures. Fischer proceeds by developing his bishop to c4, eyeing up the soft f7 point, and Black develops his bishop to d6. Then both sides castle their kings to safety. White thrusts forward in the center with d4 while opening up his bishop, and Black places his bishop on e6, challenging White's. White sees the opportunity to create a weakness in Black's position, and he does so by capturing the bishop on e6. This does undouble the pawns once Black recaptures, but the pawn on e6 cannot be defended by other pawns, and after White's next move, rook e1 attacking the pawn, it becomes difficult for Black to push it in order to get rid of it. Black defends it with rook e6. Fischer gains even more space in the center with c4, and Black develops his final minor piece with knight a6, planning to land a piece on b4. White moves his bishop to d2, aiming to maneuver it onto the long diagonal. After Black plays queen d7, connecting his rooks and solidifying his weak e6 pawn, White moves the bishop to c3, where it can spring to life after a potential d5 pawn break. Black decides to eliminate this possibility right away with bishop b4 hitting the bishop. White's queen b3 is a way to force Black's decision by attacking the bishop a second time, while also indirectly pressuring Black's queenside. Black takes the bishop and White recaptures with the pawn, not only securing his powerful central pawn, but also opening the b-file where his rook can land. Then Black reroutes his knight towards the center with knight c7. And if you thought to take the hanging pawn on b7, you'd be in for a dreadful shock, as rook e to b8 would trap the queen with the knight covering the a6 square. Fischer of course sees this. He plays a4 instead to prevent Black from breaking through on the queenside with b5. Now White might carry on with a5 in order to prevent b5 altogether by capturing it en passant. So Black plays b6 in order to meet a5 with b5, eliminating the threat of en passant. White takes this moment to play h3, creating luft for his king, and Black shifts his rook to b8, preparing his pawn break. Black's plan is still a number of moves away, so White decides to shift his sights on a more fruitful target. Rook e4 not only aims to double up on the weak e6 pawn, but also shift the rook over to the h-file where it could wreak havoc on Black's kingside. Black carries on mechanically with a6, supporting the b5 pawn break, and White drops his queen to c2, aiming to coordinate with the rook on h7 after the rook moves. Black finally plays b5. Several pawns are exchanged, and Black avoids taking it with a piece because it would allow White's c4 with tempo, so he captures with the b-pawn. At this point, Black will surely have tons of activity on the queen side, but Fischer has different plans in mind. He maneuvers his knight to d2, where it will soon leap into the center. Black slides his rook over to contest the open a-file, but White moves his rook from a to e1. Black's queen d5 is a good move with the idea of moving to f5 to defend the diagonal from White's queen once the rook moves. After White swings his rook to h4, opening up 2 attackers onto h7, Black slides the queen to f5 and hopes for an exchange. White's knight jumps to e4, stopping the trade and potentially setting up some tactics on the king side revolving around knight takes f6 check. Now White's knight for now is pinned to the queen. So Black plays e5, aiming to open the e-file and add an attacker onto the knight. But this was a mistake. The e-pawn was defending the queen, but now she is loose. And those tactics I was talking about earlier, well, knight takes f6 check would open a discovered attack on the queen, but Black would just take the knight, and even though White would get to take on h7 with check, there isn't really a good attack to follow. White would wish he could put his rook on f3 to win the queen. Back to the game. There's only one winning move here. Can you find it? Fischer has the exact right idea, and hopefully you did too. The move white plays is Rook e3. Rook f3 is coming, and it's unstoppable. Black plays h6 to at least stop the rook and queen from coordinating on h7. White moves his rook one square to f3, hitting the queen, who hastily flees to h7 where the king can defend her in case of discovered attacks. White takes on f6 with his knight anyway, and with everything under fire, black is forced to capture the knight. Then white's rook promptly exploits the open g-file while giving check, and the king slides over to still protect his queen. Fischer's final blow is rook g6. White will take on h6 next with either of his rooks, winning the queen and the game. So, black resigns. In this game, Fischer showed that the two knights attack against the Caro-Kann defense creates a dynamic and open position with plenty of opportunities for attack. In the next game, Fischer again plays e4, and this time his opponent responds with c5, the Sicilian defense. White carries on with knight f3, and after d6, he plays d4, trying to create an open position by exchanging pawns. Black captures on d4, and white recaptures with the knight. Then black plays knight f6, hitting the e4 pawn, so white defends with knight c3. Black follows with a6, the Najdorf variation, preventing any white minor pieces from landing on b5. Fischer replies with bishop c4, an opening he's played 32 times and one that's even named after him. The Fischer-Sozin attack looks to facilitate an attack on the king by placing the bishop optimally where it can pressure the weak f7 pawn. Black replies with e6, immediately blunting the diagonal. Fischer continues bishop b3, a move he's famous for. Even though the bishop isn't under attack, it probably soon will be, and Fischer wants to make sure it's tucked away nice and safely. Much to our surprise, that was sarcastic, black follows with b5, expanding on the queen side, and opening the square for his bishop on the long diagonal. White then castles, and black develops his bishop on the long diagonal where it attacks the e4 pawn a second time. So white shifts his rook over a square defending, and black develops his knight from b to d7. White's bishop g5 pins the knight to the queen, so black quickly gets his queen away, moving her to a5. At this moment, Fischer finds a way to open up the center and create chaos in the position. He captures the knight on f6, and we first note that black should not take with the pawn because he wouldn't be able to meet white's queen h5 with g6. White would have all sorts of threats like bishop takes e6, exploiting the pin on the pawn to the king. So black recaptures with his other knight, losing control of the e5 square. White pushes his pawn, hitting the knight, so black takes it with his pawn before white unveils a sweet sacrifice. Knight takes e6. Now black is not lost here. He could take the knight with his pawn, and white would take the pawn on e5, followed by the pawn on e6 next with check. White would get two pawns for the piece, while black's king is stuck in the center in a wide open position. It's still defensible for black, but scary. However, Fischer expects that in the heat of a tumultuous battle, where his side is the one firing the shots, that his opponent would go wrong. And indeed, they did. Black, in wanting to keep his pawn on e5 and the e-file closed, plays b4, counterattacking the knight and opening his queen's lateral defense of the pawn. Saving the pawn on e5 comes at a cost, though, as white is allowed to take on g7 with check. Black captures the knight with his bishop, giving white one and only one move to win the game. Can you find it? With the bishop no longer covering this diagonal, Fischer is able to play the move queen d6. This not only stops black from castling, but it also adds an attacker to the e5 pawn, where white could capture with the rook, attacking the queen and the king. Now the only way to defend the pawn is by moving the knight to open up the bishop's defense. We can rule out almost all of the options by noticing that bishop a4 check would force the queen to capture the bishop as the king has nowhere to go. White would then win the queen. So knight d7 is played, blocking the diagonal. Fischer sacrifices a second piece with bishop takes f7 check. Not taking the bishop would put the king between a rock and a hard place after rook a to d1 threatening checkmate. Black would have to retreat his queen to defend, and white could win a third pawn, getting 3 pawns for the piece, meaning material is equal, but black's king is in a terrible position. So black just takes the bishop, giving up his knight with check. Black should probably retreat his king, but this would disconnect the rooks, meaning that white could take the bishop while hitting the rook. Black wouldn't be able to take the knight, and white would be up 2 pawns. So black's king instead advances, approaching his ill fate. Fischer gathers his troops as rook a to d1 grips the center. Rook d6 is coming, and black cannot stop it. Bishop f8 would again disconnect the rooks, and white would just take the bishop. So black plays rook g8, defending his bishop so that after rook d6, the king can carry on his solemn march without hanging the bishop. h4 hits the king once more, and he continues one square. White replies queen f5, threatening a pretty pawn checkmate, g3. Black, hopeless, sacrifices his bishop for the pawn. White takes it, walking his king into a discovered check, but it doesn't really matter where the bishop goes. In the game, it lands on h6, and Fischer calmly ducks his king. Black realizes that he has no more safe checks to give, and no way to stop rook h1 checkmate. This game is just another reason Fischer earned the naming rights to the Fischer-Sozin Attack, an ultra-aggressive response to the Sicilian defense. In the third game, Fischer as always plays e4, and black replies e6, the French defense. White proceeds by taking the center, and black challenges the pawn duo with d5. White supports the d-pawn with knight c3, and black initiates the Winawer variation with bishop b4, pinning the knight and weakening white's influence over the center. Fischer chooses e5, the advanced variation, an opening he's played 47 times. Black continues c5, undermining the e-pawn, and white plays a3, hitting the bishop who captures the knight. Now with this opening choice, white did get doubled pawns, but he does have a few perks. The c-pawn helps support his center, he has a space advantage on the king side, and an open b-file to work with. Black's next move is knight e7, preparing to castle. Fischer immediately makes his intentions clear, with h4 continuing his expansion on the king side. Black, fearless, castles into the oncoming storm. White develops his knight to f3 before black takes the pawn on d4, opening the c-file. After white recaptures with his pawn, black places his queen on c7, where it can make use of the enhanced division. White's bishop d3 bears down on black's h7 pawn. In this position, black should play a move like f6, challenging white's powerful center while giving his king some breathing room. Instead, he plays knight b to c3, and white has a Greek move to win the game. Can you find it? The move is the spectacular sacrifice, bishop takes h7 check. If black does not take the bishop, then knight g5 followed by queen h5 would be devastating. If black were to play g6 to stop the queen from getting to h5, then white would play h5, and the h-file would open up whether black would like it or not. So black takes the bishop with the king, who is pierced by the sword of the white knight as it leaps to g5. Retreating would see queen h5 with the threat of queen h7 checkmate. The rook would have to move, and white would take the pawn on f7 with check, and that would only be the beginning. Now white could play the move h5 check. King f5 would be met by g4 checkmate. So the king would be forced to move to h6, where knight takes e6 would win the queen as there is a discovered check. But Fischer wants more than just the queen. He plays a4, opening up both his bishop and his rook, who could slide over to bolster the attack. Black, realizing that he's in a great amount of trouble, sacrifices his knight, capturing on e5. His hope is to get 2 pawns for the knight while giving his king some peace of mind. Now Fischer unleashes h5, and it's all over for black. King h6 would walk into the discovered check. King f6 would lead to knight h7, winning at least the rook, but likely a whole lot more, as white would hunt the king down. In the game, black settles for king f5. White plays the gruesome g4, forcing the king to f6, where it falls prey to the noxious knight h7 checkmate. In this game, Fischer showed how to crush the Winawer French defense with a brilliant trap and expertly executed attack. In the fourth game, Fischer plays the black pieces and meets e4 by his opponent with c5, the Sicilian defense. White continues knight f3, preparing d4, and black plays d6, making it safe for his knight to develop. White's d4 is immediately captured and the knight recaptures, landing in the center. Knight f6 attacks the e4 pawn and knight c3 defends. Then Fischer plays a6, the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian, an opening he's played 91 times. The Najdorf Sicilian aims to deny the b5 square from White's minor pieces while maintaining flexibility in the development of his own pieces. White's reply, bishop g5, hits the knight, threatening to damage Black's pawn structure while also clearing the lane for a queenside castle. Black follows with e6, opening his bishop and the queen's defense of the knight. Then White plays f4, gaining space in the center and preparing a potential pawn break. But with his bishop impeded by his own peer, Black's queen b6 hits b2, a point painful to protect. While White could stop Black taking the pawn, it's not appealing, giving Black a free pass at development. So he lifts his queen to d2, guarding the knight. Fischer greedily grabs the pawn and faces White's rook b1 with the only move, queen a3. White lost the pawn, but has a lead in development and an open b-file. White immediately pushes in the center with e5, hitting the knight. Black takes the pawn and White recaptures. Black avoids going forward with his knight because the exchange would open up the center, which would be advantageous for White's lead in development. So Black drops the knight from f to d7. Bishop c4, developing the final minor piece, is met by bishop b4, pinning the already once attacked knight. Thankfully, White has rook b3, defending the knight and cutting off and attacking the queen. She drops to a5 and White castles. Black also castles, and here is where the game descends into absolute pandemonium. White captures on e6, sacrificing his knight, and we wonder whether Fischer has missed something. He recaptures, and White takes the bishop, squeezing the king into the corner. He then captures the rook on f8. The knight cannot recapture because it's pinned to the bishop, so the bishop recaptures. With so many of Black's pieces on the back rank, inhibiting the rook's capabilities, White swoops his queen to f4, where it threatens to go to f7, followed by g8 with checkmate. Now Fischer has to defend perfectly here. Black would like to meet White's queen f7 with knight f6, defending because the pawn would be pinned, and if it captured the knight, he could take the piece after first exchanging bishops and stopping White's threat of checkmate. But Black cannot meet White's queen f7 with knight f6 for two reasons. Both bishops would be hanging. So Fischer constructs a master plan to get everything into place. He starts knight c6 developing while protecting his bishop. His knight is no longer pinned. After White's queen f7, Black plays queen c5 check, gaining the tempo by forcing the king to move, and he goes to h1, all while protecting his bishop on f8. Now his knight on d7 can move. Fischer finally frolics his knight to f6, and after all that, everything is defended. Black is just up a piece. White takes the bishop on c8, and Black does not even recapture, taking the pawn on e5, instead attacking the queen. She moves to e5, and again in lieu of taking the bishop, he hops his knight to g4, where the threat of knight f2 check is the nail in the coffin, and White resigns. The threat of checkmate, all while the bishop is still hanging, is too much for White. In this game, Fischer establishes that the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian is a formidable way to equalize and even launch an attack of your own. In the penultimate game, Fischer once again has the black pieces and meets d4 with knight f6. After c4, he plays his second favorite opening, g6, the King's Indian defense, a setup he's played a staggering 112 times. The King's Indian defense is a hyper-modern opening where Black deliberately allows White control of the center with the plan to attack it from the flanks and later challenge it. White continues the fight for the center with knight c3 and Black plays bishop g7 preparing to castle. White pushes e4, establishing utter dominance over the center, and Black, unafraid, castles. White pushes e4, hitting the knight, and it calmly drops to e8 before white solidifies his advanced pawn with f4. Fischer meticulously begins his counter push in the center with d6. White does not take the pawn because it would help black break free, so he develops his bishop to e3. White proceeds pounding on white's center with c5. This time white does not let black take the pawn as it would help black develop with tempo. So he captures on c5, and black ignores it, developing his knight. White captures on d6, black recaptures, and white prudently avoids taking again. He realized that if he accepted black's pawn sacrifice, the knight would be developed, the bishop's eyes would be opened, and the rook would be quick to occupy the open e-file while white's king would be shivering in fear. So he instead moves his knight to e4, attacking d6. Fischer craftily spots bishop f5, hitting the knight and opening the lane for his rook. White could exchange several times on d6, but black would duck the queen exchange, going to e8 onto the open e-file, and rook 8 to d1 would be coming next, taking full control over the center. White avoids this, dropping the knight back to g3, hitting the bishop, who retreats to e6. White develops his knight to f3, and black moves the queen to c7, where it indirectly adds an attacker to e5, and opens the d8 square for his rook. White replies with queen b1, getting off the d-file and aiming to support an f5 pawn break. Fischer finally breaks the tension in the center, capturing on e5. Then white pushes f5, hitting the bishop. Black could take the pawn, but instead he pushes e4, hitting the knight. White takes the bishop, and black takes the knight. Now white does not want to take on f7 with check, because the queen would recapture, creating a brutal battery down the f-file. So he recaptures on f3, and black follows with f5, gaining space and threatening f4 with the fork. White pushes f4 himself to stop this. Fischer quickly begins employing his troops with knight f6, looking to maneuver forward. White develops his bishop to e2, covering g4, and black shifts his rook to e8, attacking the indefensible e6 pawn. Now white could castle, getting his king out of the center, but the g-file is semi-open. So he chooses king f2 instead, since it also defends the bishop, which gets attacked after black's next move, rook takes e6. White uses the time he saved to move his rook over to fight for the e-file. Fischer puts the last piece of the puzzle into place with rook e8, and now every warrior is ready. The bishop is attacked, so white moves the other bishop to f3, opening the rook's defense. Black sacrifices the exchange, capturing on e3. White recaptures, leading to an exchange of rooks, and the king landing on e3. This next move is the master stroke of Fischer's brilliant idea. Can you find what black plays next? If you were able to find this one, then give yourself a pat on the back. The only winning move, and the one that Fischer plays, is queen takes f4 check. White has a glance at the sacrificed queen and ponders for a little while before ultimately throwing in the towel and resigning. So black's queen also hits the bishop, so the king must stay close in order to defend it. Going to e2 runs into knight d4 with the fork. White could put up a little resistance with king f2. Black would just play knight g4 check, exploiting the pin. Then after the king moves to g2, knight e3 not only forces him back to f2, it stops the white queen from going to d1, and black would follow with knight d4, attacking the indefensible pinned bishop. Going back, needless to say, Fischer, and you as well if you saw this move, also saw that if the king took the offered queen, then bishop h6 would be a picturesque checkmate. Fischer is well known for his King's Indian defense, and it's no surprise, with this being just one of his many masterpieces in this opening. In the final game, Fischer plays white and starts e4, and black replies e5. White attacks the pawn with knight f3, and black defends with knight c6. Then, Fischer, unveiling his all-time favorite opening, plays bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez, which he has played a whopping 144 times throughout his entire career. With the Ruy Lopez, white is preparing to castle, all while attacking the knight that defends the pawn on e5, which is attacked by the knight on f3. Black replies a6, attacking the bishop, and we notice that although white could take the knight, after black recaptures with the d-pawn, white taking the e5 pawn would be met by queen d4, hitting the knight and winning back the pawn. So Fischer calmly retreats the bishop, keeping an eye on the knight. Black plays knight f6, attacking e4, and black castles so that he could meet knight takes e4 with rook e1, skewering the knight and pawn. Black's b5 hits the bishop, forcing it back to b3. Then black develops his bishop to e7, preparing to castle. Rook e1 defends the pawn, and black plays d6, solidifying his center as well. White continues c3, preparing a d4 pawn break in the center. His goal is to get a powerful central pawn duo. In light of this, black plays knight a5, attacking the bishop, who retreats to c2. Then, with the knight out of the way, he can advance his pawn to c5, battling for the d4 square. Fischer thrusts forward in the center with d4 anyways. He knows that if black were to take twice on d4, he would get a weak isolated pawn on d6. Black keeps the tension, playing queen c7, indirectly defending his e5 pawn that is now attacked twice. White carries on with knight b to d2, looking to reroute the knight towards the king side. Black castles, and white's knight f1 continues the knight maneuver. Black develops his bishop to b7, pressuring white's center. White's knight g3 not only overprotects the pawn, but looks to hop forward onto a powerful post on f5. Black follows with h6, which is not a bad move, but it fights for the wrong square on the king side. Fischer immediately takes advantage, leaping his knight to f5, and his attack is almost ready to launch. Now black should realize the danger of white's piece placement. He should play a move like bishop c8 to get rid of the knight, or rook f to e8, making way for his bishop to retreat and defend the king side. Instead, he plays rook ace to c8, planning to take on d4 and exploit the pin on the c-pawn to the bishop. So white just plays d5, closing the center, and with so many pawns in the way, it's difficult for black's pieces to swing over to defend. But black seems not to have a worry in the world, playing b4 to break open the queen side one way or another. Fischer takes advantage of his opponent's negligence, capturing on h6 with his bishop. At this point, white is in the driver's seat. He's won a valuable pawn, and is even threatening another. If black were to try to defend, say with a move like knight e8, then white would sacrifice his knight, opening up his queen, then sacrifice his bishop, shattering the black king side, before bringing in his queen with check, and going for this fantastic checkmate where he lifts his rook and would swing it over with a ladder checkmate. Back to the game, black instead takes the bishop. Fischer slides his queen to c1, attacking the indefensible pawn a second time. Black could play knight g4, but white would just reply with h3. So he retreats his knight to h7 so that he can stop white's knight from hopping to g5 and support his bishop onto f6. White takes on h6, threatening checkmate on g7. So black plays bishop f6 to defend. Then white lifts his rook to e3, signaling that the end is near. And black doesn't really have a defense. He plays queen d8, adding support to g5. White stunningly sacrifices his knight as it leaps to g5. Black hopelessly takes it. Fischer swiftly shifts his rook to g3, pinning the knight to the king. And with an inevitable checkmate to follow, black resigns. The threat is to take the knight, forcing the bishop to recapture and abandon defense of g7, where checkmate would follow. Retreating the bishop to h8 would only delay things, as white would just take the knight with his rook, forcing the queen to recapture, leading to a quick checkmate on g7. Fischer's famous Ruy Lopez is ripe with tactics and attacking opportunities, making it ideal for his aggressive playstyle, so it's no wonder it was his favorite opening ever. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.